Latina show.
Hosted by IDM.
And we are live once again. Yeah, this time nothing broke except everything broke before. Hello, Nina. How are you doing?
I've been up since 3 o'clock in the morning. I'm very caffeinated. This episode is not brought to you by Starbucks. I drink Starbucks when there's nothing else to drink. I apologize. Don't sue my ass. So yes, they're not paying for this episode. No one is paying for this episode. And yeah, I am very jittery. I know.
If you want to sponsor the videos.
Very jittery, very caffeinated, very awake. I might crash from the caffeine and from my post-swim sleepiness. I don't know if you've ever experienced that. It's actually worse than cold water. So if my face is hitting the keyboard like I've announced before, this might be what happened. And yeah, I am ready to go to discuss Syria. And what we know about Syria is really nothing. There's so many theories floating around that Marcelo and I thought it would be a good idea to try to start organizing them. And there's so much overlap that we're thinking we might organize this episode of the Winter Latina show by what we know, and then sort of go country by country that are the most relevant. There's no way we're going to cover everything, so please don't complain. I know you're welcome to let us know in the comments that you guys forgot this or you guys forgot that, and that's bound to happen. Or you know, we're going to be here for 10 hours, which sounds like fun, but I'm just not sure if I can survive that long. Marcelo is a veteran. He might. He's done how long was your longest
12.
live stream? 12 hours.
Not
today. Fun. Not today. You would probably have to start in the morning, right, to do one of those gargantuan live streams. Yeah. So let's talk about Syria. And you guys, as we're discussing, when we get to the theories, and there are a few, especially regarding some countries, Russia, Turkey, Iran, Israel, of course. You guys are welcome to share your opinions. Marcelo is probably going to be the one tracking the comments. I'll look at them later because in some cases, there is not enough information to arrive at a conclusion that's definitive. In other cases, one is more likely than the other, but we still don't know. So this is a bit of an unusual episode. So first of all, let's talk about what happened. Since 2011, Syria has been in what the official Western media called a civil war. Of course, from the Syrian government's perspective, the government that has just been taken out just a few days ago, this was not a civil war. This was an invasion backed by various foreign powers. Syria was about to collapse, and then Russia stepped in, and Iran was helping out as well. Russia with its air force and activating its military bases in Syria as well. Wagner, the organization that no longer exists, was also prominently featured in that conflict. And Russia, Iran, and of course the Syrian Arab army managed to stabilize the situation. So it looked like, with the exception of parts of Syria that are occupied by you-know-who, the so-called rebels in Idlib, and then of course you-know-who, the Americans, and some other parties, Syria looked to be rebuilding, looked to be more stable than in the period between 2011 and 2015. And then all of a sudden last week, we all tune into our ex-Twitter accounts. We're watching or listening or reading live news, and we see that the so-called rebels, right, using big air quotes, when we say rebels, we're referring to HTS. I'm not going to even try to pronounce the full name, and it's basically an Al-Qaeda offshoot. So it's, initially was described by multiple Western governments, including the US government, as a terrorist organization. The leader of this organization today, al-Jawlani, was listed, had a huge bounty on his head of several $1 million just a few years ago. And what it looked like kind of an opportunistic invasion of Aleppo.
By the way, this bounty on his head is still on
it's still
the Twitter account.
I know, it's still up.
U.S. Embassy in Syria.
And of course, at that point, U.S. Embassy wasn't actually in Syria, but yes, the Twitter account existed and exists, and the bounty is still up, and it's just kind of remarkable to the way that this particular individual has been rebranded from a head chopper to a pro-diversity, democratic, moderate rebel, big air quotes here. He's been styled to look like Zelensky in the same military fatigues with a nice little haircut. Perhaps he'll even shave off his beard. And the parallels between the two aesthetically are pretty hilarious. I think they're both being styled to look like Fidel Castro and failing, but I think that's sort of the model here, is to style them as this as this Latin American revolutionary that maybe in the minds of certain people would trigger that image and hopefully connect the two, although there's very little in common, right, between the actual revolutionaries and Zelensky and this HTS rebel, again, big air quotes, leader. And so what looked like an invasion of a single city turned into basically this militant group just mowing through the entire country. And you could just see analysts saying, okay, the Syrian Arab army better hold such and such city, because the next city is, if the next city falls, they're going to get to the capital, to Damascus. And they just went through the entire country in about a week. In the beginning, you were getting official news coming from the Russian Defense Ministry and the Russian media that the Russian airspace forces were striking the so-called rebels. You were also getting the news that the Americans and the Russians once again activated their channels, specifically through defense departments, in terms of avoiding each other in Syria. Of course, at that stage, Russia was officially invited to be in Syria by the Syrian government. The US was not, but be that as it may. And within a week, all of that sort of fell apart. We had a meeting between multiple Arab countries. So we had Qatar, we had Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Iran, Iraq, Turkey, and then Russia, talking about, in all the nice diplomatic language that we're all used to, very vague, about finding a political solution to the situation in Syria. But Syria's now former leader, Assad, was not mentioned in that statement, as far as I recall. So that was very curious. And then we find out when Damascus falls to these so-called rebels that, according to the official Russian media, Assad and his family were offered asylum in Russia. Now, in the last couple of days since the fall of the capital and since the ousting of the government that has been in power, this family has been in power for decades, we find out that the Russian military, the Russian Navy, is still sort of partially operating in this area, which to me says, like, that's all we know. But to me, that says that there must be some kind of agreements with Turkey, the US, right? We know they had these military channels trying to avoid each other as they were doing their sorties, possibly Israel as well. We now know that the media, the Western media, has been working very, very hard in tandem to rebrand the former head chopper with the bounty that's still on his head as this pro-diversity revolutionary, according to the Telegraph, right, that called them pro-diversity, which is just, one of those things that blows your mind. Nothing really surprises you anymore. We know that Israel immediately, it just happened to have all this military hardware on the border, and it moved past the Golan Heights that Israel has been occupying illegally, but the United States considers that a security concern for Israel. So Israel is allowed to have security concerns. Other countries like Russia aren't allowed. We all know that's how the international rules-based order works. And we know that since then, Israel has been striking Syria, all of its military hardware, essentially all the things that protect a country and make it a state. So basically, at this stage, Syria is in a state of statelessness. It doesn't seem like, according to some reports, there are all the institutions that need to be functional, basic institution to make a state. We've all seen videos on social media. You can take those with a grain of salt, but a lot of legitimate accounts have been sharing them. And it was basically of people being targeted for having the wrong sticker on their car and then being killed in the streets, for people being asked about their religion. There's been a lot of concern specifically about the Christian minority in Syria. We know Syria was officially a secular, multi-ethnic, multi-religious state. Now this particular moderate rebel group, air quotes, is definitely not moderate in terms of its religious views. So there's all this violence that's coming out. Even if you don't believe every single piece of footage, some of it is likely to be true. So basically, it just degenerated into chaos within a week. I don't think anyone really expected that. So this is what we know. Everything else, we're speculating, and we could sort of look at all of these different countries and talk about what we think we know about them, what we know about them, and what some of the theories may be like. But I'm going to take a breather. Marcelo, do you want to chime in before I jump into our first country?
No, I think you pretty much summarized very well the situation as I see there. One thing that I would perhaps start by saying is that, well, even what we know by now, it's some things are a bit shady. I know that the first day when things started happening, I think it was last Monday on the other week, and Tuesday I had a live stream with Larry Johnson, and everything seemed I was more or less like, Russians are going to come and open that site OnlyFabs on the heads of the terrorists and all that, and all is going to be fine. Iran just bombed the ass out of Tel Aviv, so it's going to be all right. And then things crumble so fast that I was like, whoa. And on last Tuesday, not yesterday, the Tuesday of last week, things seem to be okay. There's some control, some damage control going on, yeah. But after that, it was just, rolling down. Was just rolling down. So,
and there's all this footage about the Syrian Arab army, again, take it with a grain of salt, essentially being ordered to leave. So there was no even attempt at resistance, just crumbling and leaving, which was really shocking to a lot of people. So seeing that in combination with the Russian media reporting that the Russian airspace forces have struck and killed this many terrorists, right, to use their language, and at the same time seeing the Syrian Arab army on the ground just doing nothing, you were like, wait a second, this is not going to end well, because Russia no longer is relying on Wagner, right, which was the main, one of the main, right, military forces in operating there, and it had this plausible deniability because it wasn't actually part of the Russian military, but at the same time it was getting a lot of the information coming from the Russian Defense Ministry. So it had that available to them when they operated in Syria. So that was no longer available either. And so you kind of had this really daunting just premonition, like, okay, there is like a turning point. This is happening way too quick. There's no way they're going to get to the capital. And then within a couple of days, they do.
So what happened was that by Wednesday, well, perhaps by Thursday, I was calling even my friends, my other bloggers and other YouTubers and other channels and other analysts, the ones that I know, and say, look, try to avoid opinion on this. This is, and not the only one. I'm not the savior of the bloggers, not like that, but try to avoid opinions on this. This is very weird, very strange. Everything that's going on is very weird, and I think that the propaganda machine is full steam at the moment, and I still think the propaganda machine is full steam. And later on,
it is, and I don't think, unless I missed it, I don't think. I mean, I'm assuming Assad is in Moscow because that's what some of the official media sources reported. But I don't think I've seen a confirmation from the government. Maybe there was one. Maybe I missed it.
I think there was. I think
maybe
there was
later.
a confirmation from the Kremlin. Yes.
Initially, there wasn't, and so again, that was like, is this actually? Because remember, that was being challenged by propaganda news that an airplane with the entire family had been shot down. So you kind of had two very different pieces of information coming out at the same time, obviously to muddy the water even more so than it had been. And so, yeah, I mean, not even today. I mean, we're not really that far removed from the events. We really haven't seen any other official information, government comments from really anyone. And so all we're working with is theories. So what I wanted to talk about very briefly is how Syria came to be. I don't think we need to dwell on history, but we want to look at this part of the Middle East, right? Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine. And then, of course, Palestine was split to have Israel, which has been growing ever since, for better or for worse. And so think about the Ottoman control of that region, right, in prior to World War I. And then, of course, World War I leads to the collapse and dissolution of three big empires, right? So we've had the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Russian Empire. So what happens to these, well, they're not countries, right? These regions, these territories that were initially controlled, e.g. by the Ottomans. What the League of Nations does, right? This is the precursor to the United Nations that comes out of World War I, in part thanks to President Woodrow Wilson. It basically gives mandates to Britain and France over these lands. And it's very, if you actually think about it, it's very paternalistic, because these British and French mandates don't think that the people who live in these places are capable of ruling themselves. So they need to be sort of overseen in this long period of transition. So since then, Woodrow Wilson has been criticized by talking about self-determination of countries in Europe. Remember, World War I gave birth to all of these countries that were previously part of the empires, right? Czechoslovakia, Poland got this huge boost, et cetera, et cetera. And at the same time, countries in other places that were not European did not have this random independence, raining on their heads, because they were perceived to not be capable of ruling themselves. So very paternalistic, you can use other terms here, very condescending. Be that as it may, they were ruled by these mandates up until around the end of World War II, a little bit earlier for Syria. This is when these countries gain independence. But what we need to remember, of course, is the obvious fact, is the borders of these regions that became, it's hard to call them nation states. Well, I guess you could call them nation states, but they're definitely very multi-ethnic and multi-religious, right? Like in the case of Lebanon and in the case of Syria. And so you basically had borders drawn by these imperial or former imperial powers that may not have been the best borders for the people who live there. But this is how these countries came to be. So I don't know if we want to go as far and say that the way the borders were drawn were just this ticking time bomb. I'm not sure if we can go this far, but certainly it's been problematic. It's been problematic in the Middle East. It's been problematic in Africa. We know how those borders were created as, very similarly in terms of the intentions there. So that's been an issue. But be that as it may, you had the the Syrian Arab Republic, right? It was officially a secular state, a multi-ethnic state. You had, generally speaking, people of different faiths getting along. So you had Muslims of different denominations, you had Alawites, you had Christians, et cetera, right? Many different ethnicities there. I'm not an expert on those ethnicities in Syria, so I'm speaking very sort of in bold strokes, let's put it this way. And so the borders are a problem, but I think we can take it a little bit further, because we can probably talk about the ability. So like a country is now created, right? Problematic, not problem, it exists. And then it's up to the elites, right, the rulers, to make that country stable and viable in the long term. And I think for a while, Syria may have been stable, somewhat stable and viable. However, it seems like one of the issues was corruption, right? When it comes to, I don't know if it's specific to the military or specific government mismanagement in general. And again, I'm not a specialist on Syria, so I can't go too far into this question, but like that has to be a problem if you have the situation that we've seen with the collapse of the Syrian army that just offered absolutely no resistance, right? So the ability to, corruption exists everywhere, but the ability to govern these states fairly effectively and make them viable in the long term seems to be a little bit problematic for some of these countries, in addition to the issue of having these imperial borders created, right, coming out of World War I, etc. Now, of course, the more recent issues that were very relevant are the so-called civil war or an invasion, right, coming out of the Arab Spring. We know who was cheerleading and backing the Arab Spring. I don't think we really need to go into that. This is very obvious. And we also know that these so-called rebels, right, this internal fighting for power by much more extreme forces than the secular government, problematic right off the bat. That was another issue. You had the presence of the Americans that just, were there and they just never left, even though they were there illegally and are there illegally. You had Turkey and its issue with the Kurds, right? You had Turkey being able to open and not open borders. So we'll talk about Turkey in a little bit. I don't want to go into too much detail. And we also have the crippling sanctions that were applied to Syria to basically, officially to punish the quote unquote Syrian regime, but whom do sanctions that go really as far as preventing people from getting access to certain pharmaceutical equipment, medical equipment, and medicines? Like whom are those sanctions affecting? They're affecting the regular people, right? They're not affecting the elites as much. And then we have Americans controlling what should have been Syrian oil, right? Because it's part of they're in Syria.
Yeah, I kind of lost you, but then you came back.
Let me know, guys, if you guys see
you hear me?
Or if it's Marcelo who dropped, because I'm not sure if I am visible to you guys. I'm just gonna look at the comments. Okay, I think I see the comments. So I don't know if Marcelo dropped, but I think I'm going to just keep talking. So I think we can now go into, so basically to summarize what I'm just telling you about Syria, you had multiple issues compounded on top of each other. But I think you can't just blame the imperial structuring of borders as sometimes you see from people who are more left wing, I guess I should say. So I would say all of these issues together created kind of the perfect storm for Syria. I don't know, Marcelo.
Do you hear me and see me now?
Yes.
We were both all the time on the screen, and I don't know why in the software of the camera you dropped for a second for me.
Weird, because I could definitely see the chat. I could see the chat, so I was like, I know I'm online. Sorry, guys, I don't know what's going on.
I think we were both there on the streaming software. We were both here all the time.
Sure. Okay. Well,
I don't
sounds
know.
good. So, Marcelo, based on what I said, I mean, this is obviously a very broad summary of a lot of information and more than 100 years of history. Do you kind of, is there something that you would highlight more than some of the other points that I've made about the issues that Syria was facing? Do you think the internal corruption is as problematic as some of the other issues that I brought up?
So this is looks very recent. This question of corruption. Not saying that it was not corrupt before, just saying that the big issue of corruption seems quite recent. I think there are some points. Even someone mentioned here, which is important, that Syria has been fighting for 13 years.
Right.
And Syria is a small country. There was, who was it that said? I think it was the Netherlands. Prime Minister or something like that said, it was the Polish guy. If Assad can be taken down, Putin can be taken down. Yeah, not quite the same thing, dude.
Not the same thing.
Yeah. I think his logic. I mean, he has some logic there. Assad equals president, Putin equals president. Hence, if Assad can go, Putin can go. Because you cut here, you cut there, and the math goes. But different things. So Syria is a very small country in a very complicated geographic position. Around Syria you have Israel, Lebanon, Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and I think that's it. All the 5 borders, which is already too much. Well, for Brazil, that's okay. It's a semi-continent, but it's a very small piece of land.
I think you're right about war fatigue and obviously living in those conditions. But I guess for us, we've been living on the outside world. We've been perceiving it as a country that was sort of rebuilding. Again, parts of that country were still are being controlled by outside forces, but at least from the bits and pieces that you'd see in the media, it looked like things were okay in the cities that were liberated. Yeah, right.
Okay-ish.
Right. Well, okay-ish, of course, right.
This is a very important point that you made. Yeah, you have occupied zones by the Kurds. You have occupied zones by the United States, basically stealing oil. That is a hell lot of money. You had, important to remember, last year there was this big earthquake that destroyed not only Syria, but also Turkey. Yeah, it was huge. So those things, and you had the United States not allowing humanitarian help to be delivered to Syria.
Right.
That's cruel.
Well, I mean, banning, sanctioning medications or not like there are like loopholes for medications, but ultimately many pharmaceutical companies were unable to sell to Syria. So, I mean, life-saving medicine, not getting life-saving medicine is just as cruel, right? And that's been going on since essentially the beginning of the so-called civil war. So that's what I meant. It's sort of like the perfect storm, but I think there's some issues here that impact other countries in the region that are not currently and haven't been at war the way Syria had been at war. And I think those are deeper issues. And to me, those two issues would be the ability to effectively manage these states within the imperfect borders that they were granted by the imperial design of, the Europeans / the Ottoman Empire collapsing. So I think those issues, the underlying issues, they impact other countries, not just Syria. That's how I would look at it. But
there is one detail that I think it's important somehow, and that's the fact that in May this year, last May, Assad's wife was diagnosed with cancer.
I think this is not the first time she's been diagnosed with it.
Yes, it's not the first time, but remember again, things had not been going so well on the past, and I think I would not underestimate war fatigue and personal reasons, because sometimes we just try to analyze pieces in a board, but these pieces are human beings as well.
Of course.
But I mean,
if you have personal reasons, you could then maybe step down and delegate to your ministers and other people in charge. You're not the only person in charge to, let's say, continue fighting. So obviously something else happened that we're not aware of. It's just very, shocking, surprising, insert your adjective of choice here. So is there anything else that you want to add to Syria? Again, we're sort of really briefly discussing these countries because otherwise we're going to be here for hours. But is there anything major that I missed?
Well, one important thing was that Assad was not present on Kazan, on BRICS summit in Kazan. Mm-hmm. That I think it's a quite interesting point. Mm-hmm. The fact that Erdogan has been pushing for talks for some times, mm-hmm. I think it's a very important point in the discussion.
Well, I was going to kind of talk about that when we talk about Turkey and when we also talk about Iran, but I guess we could mention it now that some sources reported that Assad was unwilling to negotiate with Erdogan at all, even though it would have made sense. And other sources also stated that Assad rejected Iran's help and also really rejected Russia's help. Very, I don't know, I don't want to call it a conspiratorial because you could see how that could be the case, but it hasn't really been verified. Let's put it this way. So I'm just mentioning it as this information is floating in the ether of news about Syria. It's relevant, but I don't want to attach myself to it.
But the fact that Assad did not ask help for Russia, you're talking about Erdogan?
He was some sources.
Now?
No, I said some sources say that Assad was unwilling to negotiate the Kurdish question and some other questions with Erdogan. He also supposedly rejected help from Iran and supposedly rejected help from Russia. None of this has been verified, but multiple sources reported this. So who knows? I think it's relevant to mention this, but this is sort of part of the theories that it would make sense that this happened because the army just did nothing, right? They were ordered to walk away. I mean, there's kind of smaller pieces of information that they were really underpaid. There was no money to pay the army. Russia is not the United States. They're not going to come in and pay the Syrian army, and they're not going to engage in state building the way that the US does. Very, very different level of involvement there. And we're going to talk about Russia momentarily because there are theories about Russia as well. But yeah, I think it's maybe relevant to mention these, but what is there to say? It hasn't really been verified. So let's jump into the question of Russia, right? So we know that the now former leader has been granted asylum. So there was at least that level of interaction. We know that in the initial days of this week-long conquest of essentially an entire country, or a regime change at least, that Russia was initially doing what it had done previously, and that is striking these terrorists that are now being rebranded. And I don't know if you saw the news, even one of the UN envoys said we can no longer call them terrorists because they're going to be the official representatives of the country. So we need to use sort of more mild terminology. Speaking of rebranding, it's not just coming from the US and the Western media, it's also coming from the United Nations. And this envoy said, whether we like it or not, we have to use more respectful terms. We can no longer call them head choppers, guys. They're gonna get a better haircut, shave their beard, look more better rested than Zelensky now, and they're gonna come and join us at the table at the United Nations. So yeah, that's another thing. But anyway, so we know that in the very first days, Russia was doing what it's been doing, and then all of a sudden, that seems to have stopped. I was watching the official accounts of the Russian Defense Ministry in Russian and in English. There was for the days that I looked at them, there was nothing about Syria. So that was very bizarre to me, because clearly this is a place where the Russian forces are officially stationed. Everything was either about Ukraine or it was some other news related to the defense ministry. So that was very, like the elephant in the room that's not being mentioned. So that, again, I haven't looked at that channel the entire time this was going on, but at the time when very serious things were happening and Russia was supposedly striking these targets, I didn't see any reports. So, I mean, I might be wrong, but I thought it was because initially when Russia was involved in Syria, there was a lot of information coming out from the defense ministry, right? Every single day, there was multiple pieces of information. And this time, no, this was not the case. So that was very unusual, fishy, weird. And so what we also know now, there are all of these, OSINT accounts showing you pictures, and then they go into like the New York Times, so semi-official media, basically saying that the Russian military presence, especially the Navy, which kind of like moved out of the way, has been really maybe reduced but untouched. So it's still there. So what does that tell you? That the Russians are still sort of there. They haven't just...
About the Assad's request for help, there was the official point from the Iran foreign minister, and the official display by Russia as well. I'm not sure if it was Maria Zakharova who put it out, that they were kind of the same. We called, we offered help. He said, no,
I guess I saw this in kind of sketchy news sources. I didn't go to the official government sources, so I was like, this news source is a little sketchy. I don't know if this is the case, but maybe this is true.
I checked the official ones. I think it was, but it was not on time. It was,
much later.
A little later, a little later, and I found it interesting. It's quite how can I say it? Synchronized, more or less, and very alike.
Sure.
So it was both of them say, okay, this is the official statement. And they went with the official statement. Okay,
well, thanks for checking. So going back to the Russian military presence, at present, well, maybe like a day ago or 2 days ago, per these, open source intelligence that's floating around from major accounts and the New York Times, the Russians are still there. They're not like as there as before. The Navy sort of moved out of the way, but they're still there. What does that tell you?
Well, Russia, if we remember when the United States were run off from Afghanistan, first thing that Vladimir Putin said was that, all right, we are going to engage with Taliban. Not the same thing, I know. Let's not go into that kind of thinking. But if this is going to be recognized as the official transition government or the official government from now on, well, Russia has to engage with them.
I think you need to go much farther than that. These people are there, this new rebel government, or whatever you want to call it, transition government, and they're watching Israel strike all their military infrastructure, hardware, etc. So that tells me that Russia is not maybe just engaging with these so-called rebels, but it's clearly continuous engaging with the US. It's very likely engaging with Turkey, and perhaps it's engaging with Israel, because Israel is the one that has been striking. So something is going on behind the scenes. The Russian army, the Russian Navy, the Russian Air Force are safe. Whether they're leaving or not, who knows? That's, a theory that we can discuss momentarily, but that you can sort of extrapolate from their presence, that they haven't just fled when Assad fled, that there's some kind of behind the scenes negotiations with the big players, maybe these so-called rebels, but I think these rebels are answering to higher powers in the very least. And so there seems to be that kind of behind the scenes agreement going on, which is like, we don't know what the Russian military will do, but for now, this is what we know. Now, this then brings the question of the very general question, does Russia need these foreign bases in this region? Some analysts say, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Well, some analysts say absolutely. If it's not going to be in Syria, we can move to, and they give a bunch of examples. They even give the example of Lebanon, which obviously Lebanon is very unstable. Some people say Algeria. Some people say, hey, why don't they just move to Egypt? It's a BRICS member. To me, Egypt has also been a long-term U.S. ally. And, we remember that at some point during the Cold War, Egypt and the Soviet Union worked together. And then there was the switch after Nasser that Egypt just changed its course and it started working with the U.S. And one of the reasons the leader of Egypt, some would say, is in power because he is described by outside sources as a dictator, but he's never really criticized for human rights violations, etc., by the powers that be that love to criticize everyone else, whether it's China or Russia, because of that relationship with the U.S. So to me, it seems unlikely, maybe not impossible, that Russia would have any kind of a military presence in Egypt, but never say never. So that brings the question of is this even necessary for Russia to have a military base in the region with access to the Mediterranean? Some analysts say yes, it's necessary because of Africa, but in my opinion, does Russia really need that particular base to continue its projects in Africa? It can travel to Africa by other routes. And this is also not the 19th century where we're just relying on sailing. This is way, way, way more technologically advanced. And so some analysts would say it's sort of like this overstretch. Russia doesn't really even need to be present there to challenge the US. But other people say it's necessary. I'm leaning towards the no camp, but I'm kind of curious what you think.
This is the kind of thing that I don't understand why countries need to have military bases in another countries. Mm-hmm. And yeah, from what I've been seeing on Telegram channels, on Russian Telegram channels, there is some kind of fatigue as well of, well, why do we keep these people there, our people there? Why are we not focusing on Ukraine, on our borders? Mm-hmm. Now we have some issues in Georgia, not so many, but yeah, you have Central Asia. Why are we not engaging more in our borders, inside our house, and why do we keep this? And perhaps this situation fell on the lap of Russia, just like, a present. Yeah, you can remove your troops from here. We don't care. What I see some analysts talking about are the ports. I don't remember the names. Too many names to remember. But the ports more for a commercial route. Russia, because Russia has already a very hard time keeping the Black Sea, and then to get the hell out of the Black Sea, you have the choking point that is the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus, who are controlled by Turkey. And when we come to Turkey, we perhaps can talk about this. But so they need a port there. On the other hand, now we're talking about Belt and Road Initiative. And perhaps that's not that is one question that every stream I did about this and others that I followed, someone asked, what about Belt and Road Initiative?
Well, what about the Russia-Iran cooperation, where they're now jointly working on various logistics projects, where they're not really they're thinking of land routes instead of traveling by sea. So there are all these other smaller projects that are relevant as well, that are sort of in the region. Mm-hmm.
Just to point it out, Syria does not cut the transition in half. She's more on the Mediterranean side, and then you have Iran, and that one touches Turkey. Mm-hmm. So those guys are. So you basically don't need Syria to create the Belt and Road Initiative. You can just go around it. if it was passing through it, perhaps it was better. But if it's not, well, bad for them.
Yeah, and you're right. I've seen some rumblings on the Russian language social media, including like patriots, not sort of anti-Putinists, saying, "Why did we have this engagement in Syria? We lost all these men." Now, most of the men lost were coming again from Wagner PMC, not the official military, but nonetheless, Russians are Russians. So why did we do this if we're now going to just abandon? Not just kind of write off the human losses, but also write off these military bases. So I don't know how prominent that position is, but I've certainly seen sort of the popular public opinion. And then, of course, the other side would be, well, it's time to cut our losses. This was never a major thing for us anyway. It was sort of an opportunity, right? Russia has been present in Syria as the Soviet Union since the early 1970s, right, with those particular bases. And this was sort of Soviet heritage that Russia inherited, right? Sorry for double heritage here. But maybe it's time to reconsider whether that Soviet heritage, this might be a good point to, a good time. Maybe it should have been done earlier, but, this is the situation that they're facing. And so maybe this is a good time to reconsider whether it's necessary at all, because that does take a lot of resources, effort, and that makes you overstretch. Now, of course, the fact that Russia has been in Ukraine, right, is a major issue. It's it's not really the elephant in the room. This is what the Western media is gloating about, that Russia is so preoccupied with Ukraine that it doesn't have the people to commit to Syria. But at the same time, I'm not sure that the people that are in Ukraine would have been committed to Syria. It was like a very different type of military. And again, it was mostly on the ground. It was mostly Wagner, right? The rest was basically trainers and the airspace forces. So it wasn't quite the same people. But yes, definitely financially, that's the focal point. So, I don't think at any point was Russia going to stabilize a country that doesn't seem to be helping itself much for whatever reason, whether it's the war fatigue, the sanctions, etc. Go ahead.
And if you think for a second, you have to remember that there were anti-air missiles, battery missiles there. There were fighter jets. There were pilots. There were personnel. And all these people can go to Ukraine now.
Yes.
And all these batteries can protect, Kursk or I don't know, whatever place that they need to protect. So it's not a game for anyone. Yeah, what I see on the Western type of analysis, everything is about territory.
It's about territory, but it's also, regardless of what happens, they're going to spin it negatively when it comes to Russia. Very infrequently do they begrudgingly admit that Russia is successful in any shape or form. It doesn't have anything to do with war. This is just how they operate. So perhaps this is sort of the silver lining here is not having to overstretch yourself by having this additional base, in a far off land, et cetera, when you have other ways to cooperate with, the African countries, et cetera, with Iran. Now, the two sort of opposing points of analysis here, and you can write them off as theories. One of them is Erdogan betrayed us. We should have never trusted him. We knew that he wasn't a trustworthy partner. Remember the episode of shooting down the Russian plane at the height of the Syrian war. At that point, we all thought that might be an escalation. It was de-escalated, luckily, but it seemed at that point, 2015, hard to believe that there would be an amicable relationship between Russia and Turkey. And just a few years later, they're working on all of these energy projects. They're visiting each other. They're talking about all kinds of cooperation. Now, there are all these purists, especially on social media. Some of them are coming out of countries that have a vested interest. So for instance, Little Armenia. Well, you should have never trusted Erdogan. And, we're not talking about our interpersonal relations, where when someone screws us over, we can just write them off. We're talking about international relations where there are no friends. There may be allies. I would say there might not even be allies. There are mutual interests. And so you are eventually going to have to talk to people that might not be trustworthy and work with what you have. It's the exact same situation, but at a much higher level with Moscow and Washington. At some point, Moscow and Washington are going to talk about Ukraine. It's not going to be the Europeans. And so has Washington been deceptive regarding Ukraine? I mean, that would be probably underestimating them. I'm censoring myself right now. But at some point, like, this is what you're working with. There's no one better. This is what you have. So I think that is the Russian perception. It's not like Putin doesn't understand that Erdogan does what Erdogan wants. Turkey, we're sort of, I don't want to go into Turkey yet, but Turkey is located in a very, very geostrategically important region between Asia and Europe. It has this sea axis. It controls, like you talked about just now, commercial shipping. And Turkey is a NATO member, probably the only NATO member other than the US that could do maybe not whatever it wants, but go a lot further than other NATO members, because there are no consequences because of its strategic position. And so it's kind of like the same thing with Russia. Turkey is going to, or Erdogan, if you want us to put it this way, is going to work with Russia in a way that it benefits them. But as soon as it doesn't, in their mind, doesn't benefit them, they're going to maybe not be as trustworthy. But, Russia is going to work with what's available instead of the ideal of what an ideal Turkish leader would be, or a leader from another country. So go ahead.
What I started to see from this very recently, because I would say until last week, I was that, Erdogan is this, he just betrays people. And as you said, doesn't Russia knows that? Yeah, of course they know that. But at the same time, what I started to perceive is that perhaps they have, they have the contact on speed dial or on their Nokia 2115, and one call another and say, dude, how bad is going to be to your reputation this type of, so for example, the release of the Azov guys from Erdogan, it's not a big deal. Russia's not destroyed because of it. It was an humiliation, but perhaps the Putin pick up the phone and say, just let him go. We hunt them later. Don't worry, just let him. It's going to look like a humiliation for us, but we can deal with this. We don't work with humiliation. We work with realities on the ground. And as you said, perfectly said, Turkey is not only a NATO member, it's the biggest NATO army. Well, some people say the second, because the first is the United States, but let's be honest, the guys there probably know how to fight better. And so it's the second biggest NATO army. I don't think Russia can simply, they can beat anyone. It would be a very costly war. And I think they understand that, as well as Turkey understand that. And
well, here's the opposite theory to Erdogan screwed us over. The opposite theory is that it's all part of the plan. It's sort of a conspiracy theory where because Russia has all of these energy projects with Turkey, remember, there's Turk Stream, which is operational, right? There's South Stream, which is not operational, but that kind of shows you a pattern of having multiple projects with Turkey. And since 2022, there's been a talk with establishing a hub in Turkey directly. It's supposed to be launched in 2025. Some analysts say it doesn't even require any infrastructure. It's basically about using what it already exists and basically using Istanbul's capacity to trade. when it comes to energy, when it comes to oil and gas. So some conspiracy theories say that this was basically a trade with Erdogan to maintain not just the existing energy projects, but to kind of push through this additional energy project that was supposed to be launched in 2025. I haven't seen any news about it since probably a couple of months ago. So I don't know what's going on with that. It's sort of been, in a lull. But if it doesn't require any infrastructure, it seems to be fairly simple to launch, where you don't actually need that construction. But anyway, and also Turkey is one of, I think it's Russia for Turkey is the biggest importer of energy. I think this happened in summer 2022. So that's specific to oil and natural gas. So yeah, it's kind of hard. We're sort of talking about Russia and we keep going into the Turkey question. I think it's kind of hard to leave it out. I think we might as well go into Turkey. But what do you think about this? So that one is Erdogan is a not to be trusted. He keeps betraying Russia. The other one is like, no, they're actually working behind the scenes. This is a trade. It's not like an ideal trade, but these energy projects and having that long-term cooperation with Turkey, more of that, I don't want to use the term entanglement, but having kind of like more mutually beneficial projects kind of ties the two countries together, even though this is not the best reliable partner that you can imagine. What do you think about that?
Well, yeah, I think there's other. That's the point when I'm saying that I'm about to have changed in about a week ago. Yeah, perhaps. Yeah, Erdogan is Erdogan. We know him. He's not the last flower on the desert, let's say, but perhaps our perception outside that he's not trustworthy. Erdogan himself respects Putin a lot. He quotes, and I quote, he says that he and Putin are the two only statists right now in the planet. And yeah, people can say, yeah, but you have China. Yeah, Xi Jinping is a good statist, but the China politics is more internal than external. It does not overflow. As long as we are in control of our zone around us, that's all right. We're good for business. We want to do business, but all these strategic things, Iran the same thing. They are very good in diplomacy, as China, as well as Russia, as Turkey. All these people are very good in diplomacy, but in statehood, perhaps would be the word. I don't know. These two guys are very competent. And that's when I say that perhaps they have their number on speed dial, because it's very hard. The Azov thing. It's a small thing. Putin said, yeah, all right. But this is huge. This is a whole country going down in Russia's backyard. This is a whole country going down. This is not some backstab. And I wouldn't see these as simple to deal as, just calling the newspapers and say, Erdogan saying, I like Putin, I like Russia, we're friends, we're good, we're fine, he's perfect. No, I don't think that would be very easy to go around. I had an interesting live stream this weekend with a Brazilian Muslim who has a channel, who's a part of a group of people that has a channel called Islamic History. And this is the other side that I had never heard. I have people like Lucas Leroy, Rafael Machado, many Orthodox that come on my channel, some Christians, some Catholics that come on my channel, but I have never listened to the other side. And from what he explained to me about Turkey is that so their secret service and intelligence are millennial, are millennial. So they have 1,000 years of existence, and they have never ceased to exist. They are still there. You have several deep state groups inside that are the Grey Wolves, for example. Mm-hmm. I had the name here. It's Boskutlar. They are very influenced in the government and outside. Something like a Wagner group. Mm-hmm. This type of relation. So what I came to realize now is that we are getting too addicted to this dichotomic bipolar way of watching. Oh, United States, the CIA and MI6 are going there and they do, and we are kind of ignoring a big player here that is Erdogan and Turkey. Yeah, it's not a huge country, but they have their a huge importance there. Recently, if we want to throw this data also on the math, recently we had a demonstration from Iran that I mentioned earlier in Israel that changed the balance of power of the region. That did change the balance of power in the region. Perhaps Turkey, perhaps this is a strong hand from Turkey saying, yeah, we're still here. We are still influenced, especially on the Islamic world. Turkey lost a lot of support. Well, they didn't lost, even though there are different things, different groups inside the Islamic world, the Salafi and Wahhabi and, Alaudi and, Shia, Sunni. But when you have a representative of that showed strong hand, that was important for the Islamic world. So everybody started to look at Iran. So now they are taking down and I'm not saying this is the reason. I'm not saying this is speculative. So now they are taking down a secular state. And from what I've been seeing, they're pretty much creating a Islamic state, another Islamic state. So not saying this is the reason, but all these things are also on the math in my view of things.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on Turkey, but it seems to me that there's this push-pull between a more secular Kemalist Turkey versus the more religious Turkey. And for Erdogan specifically, many analysts talk about his neo-Ottoman aspirations, where is having the status of maybe reclaiming or partially controlling some of the former glory and lost lands in places like Syria would be beneficial for their domestic perception and perhaps their perception in the Islamic world. I'm kind of very careful with maybe saying this, but also it's instrumental because from Erdogan's perspective, they have a problem with Kurds. So they're kind of dealing with that problem in Syria. And they're sort of, from his perspective, at least attempting to solve multiple problems with, a single gunshot here, right? So two birds with one stone, maybe multiple birds with one stone. So they're dealing with the Kurdish situation. They're projecting power. They're obviously, go ahead.
Since you mentioned the Kurds, I think it's also important on the timeline to remember that 2 years ago, NATO called for Sweden and Finland to join it. And Turkey was the only vote against it. And Erdogan was very, very careful to say that, okay, we will vote positively, but we want the Swedish to extradite the PKK people that they are holding there, which are the Kurds. So Sweden and Finland joined NATO. There was no official exchange of Kurds to Turkey.
Yeah,
this is what we know.
Exactly. This is what we know. Officially, nothing happened, but Who knows what went on behind the scenes? But of course, the other thing is that there's been all this talk about Turkey joining BRICS. And when the Syrian situation happened, this very rapid collapse, some people said, thank God Turkey is not in BRICS. Other people said Turkey should still be in BRICS. And this is another point of contention, right? I mean, obviously, having a NATO member in BRICS, although BRICS is supposed to be a non-alignment economic organization, but for some players like Russia, it's a way to push for more multipolarity. And so having a NATO member would be, some would say problematic. Some would say that would be beneficial because that's sort of pulling them away from this military alliance a little bit. You also have Turkey's aspirations in the Caucasus. There's some influence in Georgia, but I think the more obvious influence is the relationship with Azerbaijan. And of course, Azerbaijan's relationship with Armenia. We know that Armenia's official government has been very destructive. Somehow Armenians keep that government in place with, Pashinyan as the leader. Russia has been criticized for not intervening sufficiently in Armenia. From my perspective, why would you intervene when the government is doing everything in its power to destroy what's left of the Armenian-Russian relationship? This is the view that's shared by a very large Armenian diaspora in Russia. I'm not sure which one is larger, whether it's the one in the US or the one in Russia, but I've seen this time and time again, where the Armenians who live in Russia are even more critical than I would be. So definitely, Turkey has that strong interest in the Caucasus as well. Whether you can write it off as also having this new Ottoman aspiration or not, perhaps it's Erdogan's personal ambition. Perhaps it goes further than that. But be that as it may, I think this is probably one of the major players here, if not other than the US, if not the most, the biggest player. And its relationship with Russia is, to me, kind of unclear. But in the very least, the fact that the Russian army seems to be safe tells me that there are lots and lots of behind-the-scenes talks with multiple players. And I think unless you have something else to add about Turkey, I think this might be a good place to discuss Israel a little bit.
Yeah, just to remember everybody that not too long ago, it was the Putin who saved, the betrayal ass of Erdogan from a coup.
Yes.
And just last year, it was last year or the year before, I kind of lost on the timeline now here, but there was elections in Turkey, and the West was doing everything it could to get rid of Erdogan. So right now, and I remember the time, probably Erdogan is a better thing for this situation in Ukraine. And then just after that, he started, flip-flopping around and throwing Azov guys and then accepting the entrance in NATO from Sweden and Finland and all those things. But again, if the West is trying to get rid of the guy, perhaps he's not this bad of an apple.
Well, perhaps. I think this is. We can also talk about Turkey as it comes to Israel. So, where do we begin with Israel? There is a war. I mean, we're going to have to be very selective in our language because of the YouTube policies, but basically Israel has been engaged in a quote-unquote operation in Gaza, which according to every single humanitarian organization and the United Nations had been devastating to the civilian population of Gaza. We know that there was a ceasefire between Lebanon and Israel, which Israel wasn't exactly adhering to. And as there is the ceasefire, the Syrian situation heats up, and Israel just happens to have all this hardware in the Golan Heights, which, of course, internationally are not recognized as Israeli territory. The United States, we've seen multiple American officials talking about, well, the Golan Heights are a major security concern for Israel, so it should be there. No one else is allowed to have their security concerns. But be that as it may, so Israel first waltzes in, right, with this hardware that it just happens to have on the border or the perceived border, and it goes farther into Syria. It's engaging in striking this military infrastructure that's been there since the Soviet period. Basically, this is the thing that allows a country to be a country and defend itself. So all of that is being destroyed. The so-called rebels are just kind of standing aside and watching all of that play out. So that raises all kinds of questions of why are they not defending the country that they're supposedly liberating from the brutal tyranny of Assad and his father? Very good question that you can put on your tinfoil hats and draw your own conclusion. And we know that there are basically two sort of theories here. One that's very popular on social media is that Israel is pursuing a policy of greater Israel, and all kinds of maps are floating around. You have Israeli newspapers talking about taking southern Lebanon, taking parts of Syria as what should be Israel. And basically, it's something that's been pre-planned for a very long time, and it's part of their strategy. Well, I mean, that theory there's some justification for it, because if you look at the very establishment of the state of Israel, right, it was backed by the United Nations, by the Soviet Union, by the United States, all the major players. As soon as the country is established in the late 1940s, it basically engages in ethnic you-know-what to expel the people who are living there. And ever since then, it's been expanding. So from the Israeli perspective, expansion is basically a guarantee of its survival with hostile neighbors all around. This is how they think. From the perspective of people who keep losing land and lives to Israel, they think a little bit differently. You can extrapolate. Again, I'm going to be self-censoring here. And in the maybe near term and in medium term, Israel is quite successful. If you think about the way that it came to illegally possess Golan Heights, this was in the context of the Six-Day War, right? What they call the Six-Day War in 1967. As a result of that war, Israel ended up occupying Golan Heights, right, from Syria. It ends up taking the West Bank, including East Jerusalem from Jordan. It ends up going into Gaza and the Sinai, which used to officially belong to Egypt. So one theory is that this is all part of the plan. The opposite theory is that actually Israel isn't thinking that strategically in the long term, that it's actually just going along with the opportunities that present themselves, right? So it sees a weakened Syria, it sees an opportunity to go in. Israel is used to acting with impunity because since the late Cold War, the US wasn't such a big backer in the beginning, but towards the late Cold War in the 1970s and onward, it did become a major backer of Israel. So Israel is used to basically getting away with the types of things when it comes to international law that other countries are never going to get away with. We see the contrast in the way that Russia is treated in its special military operation versus Israel, engaged on multiple fronts. And of course, the circumstances are very different, right? Russia is working with a territory that used to belong to Russia, and also the people who are expressing self-determination per the UN Charter, wanting to be separate from the regime in Ukraine. This is not what's going on with Israel's neighbors. Nonetheless, Israel is able to strike multiple countries and nothing happens. We see the response to the International Court when it issued a warrant for Netanyahu. We see the responses coming from major Western capitals that they're not going to respect that. And at the same time, this week, we're seeing that the International Court should pursue Assad for the same type of crimes that Israel cannot be punished for. So it's just that, we're so tired of pointing out the hypocrisy, but kind of seeing the two side by side is very kind of like gallows humor amusing, not like funny haha, but funny gallows humor kind of funny. And so this is what we see. And so in that theory, where Israel is not operating according to this greater long-term plan, but actually just taking opportunities, and when it takes these opportunities is quite successful, it doesn't quite consider some of the consequences that might happen by creating chaos in its neighbors, because that is bound to give you unintended consequences, right? We've seen this time and time again with Iraq, with Libya, with Afghanistan. And so there's no foresight about what that would create with the refugees going to Europe, with the anti-Israel sentiment. We saw the incident in Amsterdam, right, a few weeks ago with the soccer match, which the Israelis painted as a pogrom, but the locals painted as, oh, it's just the hooligan, soccer hooligans or football hooligans fighting each other. So there are all of these unintended consequences on big scale and small scale that may impact Israel. What do you think?
Well, yeah, starting by the consequences. Just today, I was, actually yesterday, today, I was watching the Duran analysis.
You sure bring up our competitors a lot here.
Yeah, I don't even consider myself far away from competitor to those guys.
Why do they have 500,000 subscribers and I have 2,000? I don't understand that. There's no difference.
I'm that good. No, yeah, of course. By the way, if they watch this, you're invited to come to our show as well. I was watching Alexander McCree exactly pointing that out, that, chaos and havoc it's bad for Israel. At the same time, this live stream that I had with Ali Ramos last weekend, perhaps some doors are going to be open for groups that are actually militarized, really militarized, and really against Israel. And I'm not talking about the Al Qaeda, rebranded dudes. I'm talking about big guys, from Turkey as well. And so situations, it's much more complicated than it looks like to us. I will not extrapolate on that because, to be very honest, it was a lot of information and I have to revise that because it was a huge conversation with a lot of information that I had no idea before that.
My hunch would be the latter, because I think it's really nice to spread the idea of greater Israel, and perhaps this is something that does exist in the collective mind, but I don't think they necessarily have this long-term plan. It seems like there is a response, and sometimes they're militarily successful because they have the backing of the United States, in addition to the way they perform themselves. And so it seems to be more based on the immediate circumstances instead of having this plan going out for decades. But now it is part of their security. It is part of their security concept that they need to extend more, right, beyond their borders, because they're surrounded by countries that they consider hostile, right? So from their perspective, I'm not sharing my perspective. This is how they perceive their neighborhood where they live.
Just yesterday, if I'm not mistaken, the Times of Israel, some Israeli newspaper, I will say Times of Israel, I'm almost sure.
You're talking about the Lebensraum article that got taken down?
Yeah.
Yes, the language was just there's been a few. There was one publication that in the last month or a month or two said that southern Lebanon should really be ours. And I was like, okay, that's a little blunt. And then this past week, it was Israel needs more Lebensraum because of our birth rates. And then within 24 hours, that article was taken down. But of course, the internet is forever. So I don't know if it's on the archive. It's definitely up in screenshot form. And I thought the language was very interesting to actually use the Third Reich language to talk about expansion was a little bit shocking. So that's what I mean. It's not like this idea doesn't exist in their collective mind, but that doesn't mean that the government has this long-term strategy of this is going to be our state and we're going to conquer. I mean,
let me send a big hello and regards to our friend Kavor Kalmasyan that I tried to contact to come today, and he just answered me. I know he's completely out of reach for now. He's been on 4 podcasts. He just wrote me, I've been just in 4 podcasts today, plus RT and other newspapers. I tried, because I think it would be very constructive for our conversation.
Well, so, in my opinion,
to our friend.
He's in a difficult position. If I'm not mistaken, he still has family there. So I think what I've seen him posting lately reflects the fact that he might be very concerned about the safety of his family. So some of the statements he's made were a little bit surprising to me, but I think it's motivated. My perception is that it's motivated by his concern for family. Therefore, he was phrasing things a certain way. I know some people attacked him for it, but that's kind of how I perceive it. But anyway, we can move on from this. Do we have anything else about Israel? Because I think we should still talk about the big guys like the US.
Yeah, sure. But I think it's important because we are seeing this operation. I forgot this something arrow. Something that they are doing to create this buffer zone to protect their lands and all that, but the arrows from the operation kind of point in the way of Damascus. I'm not sure how far they're intending to go with this operation, but Wikipedia.
Well, I think the most recent reports is that they're within like less than 100 kilometers or so. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, it might be a little bit more, but really not far from Syria's capital. And of course, even before this escalation, Israel was consistently striking like the airport in Syria. So this is nothing new. It's just the same thing on a much, much larger scale that's been going on prior to basically the collapse of the Syrian Arab Republic. But I think we should
just to point out that it's been a year and they haven't finished Gaza. And the conflict with Hezbollah in South Lebanon, it didn't end well for Israel. Well, it had.
Well, I think we can discuss that maybe in the context of Iran, because that's the connection here, right? Or one of the connections. Mm-hmm.
Just to point out that they are stretching themselves.
Well, do you want to talk about Iran a little bit before the U.S.? Because this would, this is sort of the connection here. So Iran, what the maybe mainstream Americans would call, the most awful people in the world, what left-wingers called the resistance axis, and some of them are saying it no longer exists, right? This is the connection between Iran, Syria, Palestine, and some of these militant groups in Lebanon and in Palestine. And so one of the explanations for targeting Syria was basically cutting off the supply lines to these militant groups outside of Syria, right, like in Lebanon, by basically making Syria non-functional. Many analysts have pointed out that Syria was one of the only Arab nations that was actually explicitly supporting Palestine, and the others were basically doing a lot of talking and not doing much. And that is to the question of the, unity in the Arab world. And I am not a specialist in this field, but I think it's pretty easy to conclude that on that particular question, there's a lot of PR, but not a lot of help to the Arab Palestinians, right, living in Gaza and elsewhere. And so one of the explanations regarding Iran is that basically it's making Iran more isolated, right? That connection is now severed. And we already discussed the news with Iran basically saying that Assad declined military help, which, is a major point, much like the case of Russia. And to the extent to which Iran is isolated, certainly it's considered to be by, Washington, by, oh, here comes the dog. He's like, you guys have been talking for too long. I don't want to hear about Iran. I want a treat.
So he's Republican.
I know, he's Republican. He's like... But yeah, so basically the situation is that, yes, Iran is one of the designated, remember George W. Bush's axis of evil? It's basically that versus, 2.0. And obviously the relationship between the United States and Iran and Israel and Iran is, a very difficult relationship, let's put it diplomatically. So yes, Iran is possibly the target, one of the bigger outside target of this Syrian situation. I'm not sure the extent to which it's really isolated in terms of its own foreign policy, right? Because Iran has this relationship, right, with Russia. That's a growing relationship. They have multiple economic projects going. They have military strategic projects going. There's BRICS, of course. So from that perspective, Iran is not isolated. But from the perspective of what some people call the worst people in the world and other people call the resistance axis, yes, that's definitely been severed, and there's a lot of dooming going on in that sphere. What do you think?
Again, I'm not sure that this is a problem for Iran. Yeah, perhaps there is a problem for Hezbollah to get some supplies from Iran, but yet to the same time I see some analysts saying that this is very easy. You can just, in the middle of chaos, you can just bribe people, and get your stuff done. It was very interesting that I saw before this. Before the taking down of Damascus, I saw some news from Israel as well. I don't know if you see this. Basically, that the Israeli government telling Iran not to trade with the terrorists to get weapons to Hezbollah. And I was like, okay, but let's just understand something before it. Iran is Shia. The Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS. The HTS is Sunni, Salafi, and as Lucas Leroy usually say about the Salafis and the Shia, if you give a gun with one bullet to the Salafi and put a Jew and a Shia, he's going to shoot the Shia.
Wow.
This is how the situation is. So it made no sense to me at the beginning watching this. Nobody knows this, So this is one point that I was talking about with Ali, and I was talking also with Larry Johnson yesterday. We talk about, the Arab world, and people think, oh, everybody there is Arab. No, it's different. Iranians are Persians, Turkish are Ottomans or Turkic. Every Islam is one thing. No, you have these differences.
Well, I think we shouldn't exaggerate sectarianism too much. I know this is one of the things that actually really irritates people who actually live there. Perhaps when it comes to extremist militant groups, this would be more relevant, that Shia-Sunni distinction for Salafists. But it might be a little bit less relevant in terms of the sort of the general population. So I don't want to exaggerate sectarianism too much. It's a popular Western talking point, and I know people in the region are not very happy with that particular talking point. But I don't think Iran is...
The thing is that we have to pay attention on the news, especially, because not everything is exactly related. We have to understand that there are shades of gray there that needs to be understood, because otherwise Israel can just say, yeah, Iran, the bad guy, is going to be with another bad guy, a terrorist group, to army another terrorist group.
But this is only going to work on maybe the average Western media consumer, to whom, all Islam is the same and all designated bad guys are the same. I don't think it's going to work on sort of more serious people. But I mean, I haven't personally seen this particular bit in the news, but yeah, I think you're right, though. I think for Iran, it might not be as problematic, but for these groups, it may or may not be, depending on what happens in this chaotic situation. So I think for the sake of time, we should now move over to the US, which I think is the most obvious player in this regard. The US, Washington, has a history of relying on these militant groups, whether it's the extremists in Ukraine, whether it's funding the extremists in Afghanistan, even before the Soviet Union was invited by the government in Afghanistan to enter that country legally and basically participate into what turned into a Soviet-Afghan war. This predated, right, that the funding of these extremists predated the Soviet entry. So that tells you a lot about the thinking of Washington strategist, I guess. And it talks about, that whole idea of such and such ruler or such and such group might be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. We talked with Nebojša extensively about funding groups in the Balkans that are less than savory, but they were serving that relationship with the KLA. They were serving a particular purpose for American geopolitical goals. So there's this very, very long history. So when it comes to this particular group, right, we started our episode off by mentioning the wanted poster that is still up on the Twitter account of the US Embassy in Syria, where the prize, the bounty, is huge. I think it's like 10 million or something like that. And it's very much reminiscent, and lots of analysts have already compared this to that famous 1993 article featuring Osama bin Laden, described as, quote, the anti-Soviet warrior on the road to peace. We know what happened 10 years later. So there's also that history of uncontrolled chaos and things not necessarily working out the way that the people who think they're in charge would actually work out, these unintended consequences that can be quite awful. And I think this is another example. I think some of the worst predictions I've seen for Syria is Syria has to choose between being Libya after the NATO invasion or choose to be Afghanistan. Those are the two choices, right? Both choices sound pretty awful considering what's happened in those two countries, right? Since in Afghanistan, since the early 2000s, and in Libya since the second decade of the current century. And so, again, I don't even want to go into the hypocrisy of saying that Tucker Carlson should not be interviewing Putin and Lavrov. At the same time, CNN is interviewing this reformed head chopper, again, dressed like Zelensky with a nice little haircut. UN saying that they need to be rebranded from being called terrorists. And so... Which,
by the way, the CNN reporter was wearing the hijab.
Of course.
And not too long ago.
I only saw pictures of her from the back, but she was fully covered. So I think it wasn't just a hijab. I think she was wearing more than that.
Fully. Okay. I only saw the picture from behind.
I don't know what was going on with her face, but it looked like she was fully covered. So it's a little bit more. Yeah.
1 year ago, Larry Johnson remembered that yesterday in our chat. 1 year ago or 2 years ago, that Christian Amanpour refused to use the hijab in the presence of some diplomat of Iran.
This was big news. This was feminism.
Yeah, exactly.
But
now, who cares about feminism?
Guys, I know this is a pro-diversity former head chopper who's been reformed. It's okay for a woman to well, the fact that they would even send in a woman to interview this person and at the same time have her fully covered, I don't even understand their thinking. because people are going to notice that. And they might, I mean, maybe not everyone, but some might remember the refusal by the famous anchor Christiane Amanpour, right?
Christiane Amanpour.
Yeah,
a sophisticated journalist.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's so many layers to hypocrisy. I think, again, it's kind of reliant on the assumption that people have a very short attention span. They just remember the recent news cycle. They're not going to remember what happened a few years ago. But yeah, I think Washington has been pretty open with what it's been desiring for Syria since the beginning of the Arab Spring. Nothing really changed there. I think the more interesting change was that in the mid-2000s, you can go and Google articles that glowingly portray the Assad family and basically talk about his wife as almost like this Princess Diana of the Middle East and how amazing they are. And then there was this change. Okay, we now got to get rid of this guy. He's a brutal dictator who is using chemical weapons on his people. There are now calls by, the former Human Rights Watch head, Ken Roth, to basically include HTS in one of these international courts to target Assad, which is, I don't even have any words for that. It's just like you tune in and it's just like, am I actually reading what I'm reading? But apparently I am. And so I think I'm not fully certain with what the US position is now. Like, as you said in the very beginning, it's a little bit murky, but what the official Washington position about Assad had been from the beginning of the Arab Spring, that is very clear. And, supporting various militant groups financially has been well publicized by American media. So we're not being conspiratorial here by mentioning this. And I think there's even been articles, I think it was in the LA Times from a few years ago in the middle of the quote unquote Syrian war, where group funded by the Pentagon was fighting the group funded by the CIA, but it was not a joke article. It was an actual news article. I'm pretty sure it was the LA Times, but that sort of showed you the intention there, right? Having that controlled chaos, kind of like what Israel seems to be preferring as far as its neighbors go, right? Having kind of weaker, chaotic neighbors. But in terms of what Washington wants now, I think it's a little bit more murky, other than issuing statements that Assad should be prosecuted by, an international criminal body. I haven't really seen anything specific about that government transition in Syria or anything else beyond that, which I think is interesting. I'm not sure if they're waiting for the new administration. That certainly hasn't been the case when it comes to Ukraine, right? The Ukraine strategy has been very clear, right? Escalate, escalate, escalate until the administration is out. As far as Syria goes, it's a lot murkier for me. What do you think?
Well, since you brought out Libya, for example, there is one interesting point that we can add to the video, not discuss too much, because I think this is to be discussed in length. That is the invasion of Libya. The Telegraph and some other newspapers kind of pointed to Assad as being the person that gave up the Gaddafi's position to the French. I throw that because I know that that's mainstream media and that's the Telegraph, so all roads takes us to London. So I'm kind of divided if it really happened or if this was already some pointing to the next invasion that would be.
Well, have you seen that edited UN video where Gaddafi is giving a speech and Assad is laughing, but he's not laughing at what's being said, yeah. And it's edited for that kind of an effect. So my hunch would be what you're implying as opposed to the literal interpretation of that article. But I don't know. I'm not sure.
No, yeah. So the conversation yesterday with Larry Johnson, Assad, for sure, the government of Assad allowed the prisons to be used for, shady operations. And these things comes back to bite you in the ass at some point. And
Well, wouldn't you say
Perhaps
that
it won't.
many other countries, including those that are considered U.S. friendly or U.S. allies, like Egypt, possibly have such prisons?
George Galloway just this week kind of made Pierce Brosnan, no, Pierce Morgan, to eat his own tongue when Pierce kind of, yeah, but Assad is a dictator. And then George Galloway say, yeah, so it is Mohammed bin Salman, and he is our best friend. On England, of course.
Right.
So this is the perception. There is no,
good dictator, people. Bad dictator, good elections, dictator, bad elections. Come on,
exactly,
it's the rules-based order. Nothing makes sense. Only things that, I mean, if you examine it from the standpoint of what benefits the so-called rules-based order, it does make sense. But yeah, I think,
and at the same point, the diplomacy of the region, it's very complicated. Everybody knows that, from time to time, one is going to stab the other one in the back. This is going to happen. He was smart enough, perhaps, to understand that his time has come, and called the Putin and say, "Dude, remember that I kind of need a favor. I
want to open an ophthalmology office in Moscow. Yes, I want to go back to my old job."
Yeah,
I just want to work at the local lens crafters selling glass. There's no lens crafters in Russia, I believe. Or if there were, they probably would have been gone with sanctions. But yeah, I just want to go to my own. No, I don't want to make fun of him. I think some people really turned on him. I don't really think he had much of a choice. And I think he really held out for a long time. And I think being called a lion has been accurate for a certain time period. And I think he just kind of, perhaps it's for personal reasons, like you're saying, his wife's recurrent cancer and other issues that we don't know about because we don't have that information. But yeah, the way some commentators have turned on him, people who were sort of not like supportive of him, but saying what will come after would be worse. And now they're sort of much more critical. He abandoned Syria, he did this and that. I don't think that's necessarily fair, but that doesn't mean that he is this amazing humanitarian in the way the Westerners would prefer him to be. No, but again, you have to look at the reality and what you're working with versus the ideal version of or this and that country that there's going to be this nice unicorn respecting Tsar, king, dictator who frolics in the fields of daisies and doesn't have any prisons and there's no corruption. I mean, you kind of have to analyze your choices, right? And go with the best one. And chaos for the people who live in these places is never the best choice. I mean, I think that would be a very obvious comment to make. Marcelo, we've been going for almost 2 hours.
Just to point out two things. Well, one thing that's very important that you mentioned, the administration on the United States is leaving, and so far they have made everything possible on their hands, and if it's impossible, they tried anyway to make the next administration hell, to bring hell to the next administration. So yeah, why not? Perhaps this is another trick. This is just another trick. Well, let's create havoc on this region. One more havoc on this region. And just to point out, I at the same time, I saw it was very shy. The U.S. Was very shy on this situation. They did not come out, crying victory. Yeah, they did some cry of it, but it was not this huge megalomany. Yeah, we showed Putin. Yeah, we showed
Trump. Did Trump not make a post of Putin is weak? He should have never been there. Blah 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 blah. I mean, he's obviously posting this in his personal capacity, and a lot of times it's this like stream of consciousness. Although I do have to say his Twitter since the initial, fiasco years ago seems to be much more managed and curated versus the constant stream of consciousness we've had. But he was very critical of Putin. I assume it was a real post on his social media from what I've seen.
Truth. Yeah,
exactly. And so Russia should have never been there. Putin is weak, blah, 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 blah. So, I mean, again, he's in his personal capacity, but he is the incoming administration in just over a month.
Which, by the way, just to point out, the original post on Truth Social was edited to come to Twitter, because the original post was mentioning, apart from Assad, it was mentioning also the death rate of Russian soldiers.
Oh yes, I did see that, and it seemed to exceed the Ukrainian one, which
but the thing was that in the original post, he was mentioning 500,000 Russian kills and 400,000 Ukrainian kills. Killed. But in Twitter, in the X post, he only mentioned the Russian killed.
Interesting.
So I kind of heard rumors that
that number seems to be coming out. That number seems to be coming out from Ukraine's defense ministry. So
of course, no. But the thing was that it looks like Zelensky pick up the phone and say, "Hey, bro, you put that we lost 400,000 people. You can say that."
But at the same time, did you see that Trump's son tweeted out the Home Alone Photoshop meme with Trump and Zelensky being photoshopped into that image, and then Elon Musk posted these, LOL smileys, and then some of these Ukraine supporters just absolutely lost it. Like, this is what they think of Ukraine. They're not taking us seriously. It was pretty interesting. It was pretty fun. Yeah.
Why should they? Yeah, no, but so I think the reaction from the United States was very shy. The only post I saw from POTUS, the president of the United States, on Twitter, and that's why I talked about Libya and Assad. The only tweet about this that I saw relevant about this, they were saying, well, yeah, the huge dictator has gone, Assad is gone, and now we are going to engage with the moderate rebels. So 13 years of war, why did the United States not once engaged with Assad?
Yeah,
and now they're going to engage with these crazy people.
I mean, this is the theory of controlled chaos, right? But it always seems to bite you in the ass. I mean, pardon my French. So I think this is probably the best we can do. We are not going to go into detail about Egypt and Saudi Arabia, although those are relevant players as well. But I'm just curious as to what you guys think. I know there's a lot of comments going on right now, but maybe go post in the actual comments so I could see them on this video after the stream. Marcelo, are there any questions?
No, there were more comments, yes. There was one question, and it was about the Wagner group. So I don't think it's... So the question was basically, why did they use a German name? Why does Russia... It was who cares? Why does Russian use famous German name Wagner?
Well, I think it's about I can't remember whether it's the composer. I'm pretty sure it's the composer that was of interest.
The musician.
Yeah. Which is why, exactly, this is why they're called the musicians, or were called the musicians, right? So yeah, but I mean, Wagner is obviously not around anymore. What was left of Wagner was, if they were interested, right, those soldiers were incorporated into the official Russian armed forces. So for better or for worse, I mean, I have my own opinions about it, but I think this is beyond the scope of this particular episode. But I think this is probably as well as we can break it down. And I have leanings towards certain theories that I brought up. So, for instance, why does Israel act this way? Is it this great grand plan, or is it more opportunistic about the Russian actions here? But I don't know if I can come up to a definitive conclusion until I see things play out a little bit more. And I also, of course, you can judge people in two ways, right? By their statements, by the official government statements that mean something. They may not mean what the statement intends to mean, but also by the actions. So I'm really curious about the relationship between Russia and Turkey, what we're going to see from those two in the coming months, because I think that's sort of at the crux of Russia not intervening, more so than any US involvement or Israel, because those two are sort of more connected, and they're connected to to Gaza and to striking Lebanon. I think the Russia-Turkey is sort of like a separate knot in the situation that is also, I mean, it's related, but it's sort of closer together. So I think when we see what's going on in that relationship, we can kind of see, we can sort of retroactively extrapolate what's happened. This might not be the only episode we do on Syria, because obviously the situation is extremely dynamic. We are hoping to get a couple of guests with more direct contact with Syria that would be more of an expert than us generally analyzing geopolitics of multiple countries. So I think that would be really interesting. Let us know if you guys would like to see that. But be that as it may, if there are no comments and no questions, I think, Marcelo, it's time for you to get some rest, to not look like, you're not looking like Zelensky today.
No. Just Jelani. He's looking like Zelensky.
I know, right? You have longer hair than Al Jelani. Oh my goodness. All you need is like the headgear. And he's got a shorter haircut than you. I know, exactly. So
you're wearing the QE t-shirts today.
Almost, yeah. It's not quite khaki. It's just kind of like a green. But maybe next time I can do that to find my military fatigues, and present myself in that way. But yeah, thank you guys for tuning in. This was a little bit different than our usual. I think theories, though, are kind of interesting, and I think talking about them also kind of helps us arrive at certain conclusions, kind of flesh them out a little bit more. And again, I'm going to go look at the comments, but for now, we're going to tune out. Thank you for staying with us for so long. This was a long episode, and we'll see you in the next one. Marcelo, any parting words?
Remember to like, share, subscribe the videos. If you want to help the channels, you know how to do it. And see you guys next week. See you.
Bye. Bye. Thank you.